Do you have the experience of having found a subject you really wanted to draw and you draw it, and in lots of ways it's a reasonable drawing and it's pretty accurate, and yet you can't help but feel that it's got a more cartoon-like quality than a sense of capturing reality, that somehow it still looks artificial in that simplified cartoon way? I want to use this drawing to highlight 6 areas of technique and line work which I feel, particularly taken together, build up a very cartoon-like effect. So if we're wanting realism, these are things we want to try and avoid in our drawing. And the first problem is a heavy, dark line everywhere. If we think of cartoons, particularly cartoons of our youth, everything does have a heavy line around it, and that works well for a very simplified, stylized representation of whatever the object is. But a heavy emphasis on line, and with lines drawn all the same weight and with all the same sturdiness, regardless of where they are, it doesn't create a sense of realism. When we look at a subject, some of the lines stand out strongly, although sometimes it's for color variation rather than actually a line. In fact, there aren't a huge number of very heavy outlines. Where there are, it's normally shadow that's being caught. Another way that line work often becomes cartoon-like, not particularly in this drawing, but where, as well as heavy line everywhere, there is a particularly heavy outline. And when I look and see a heavy line around the outside of objects, sometimes I even get the feeling that the artist has done them without thinking. It's just something that they do, and so they do it without giving it much thought. Like, well, of course it's a good thing to emphasize the actual shape of the building. But again, that's not what we see in life, and so it doesn't add to a sense of realism. In fact, it can make it very difficult to know what's what, and it really works against creating a sense of depth. And I think because there is an emphasis on drawing outline and drawing objects, we do end up with a lot of lines, and we end up with all of those lines at the expense of marks that we could have put on the paper to create effect. But our focus has been on lines, not marks. And lines, particularly when they're outlines, very much associated with a cartoon effect. We're much better off thinking marks rather than lines when we hover our pen near a blank sheet of paper. Second area, really common, is a lack of depth lines. And by depth lines, I mean the lines that create the sense of 3 dimensions. These are depth lines here. Oops. These lines, the lines that show something is set back, that it's not just a surface. These are the depth lines. That's the depth line. They take a 2-dimensional shape into a 3-dimensional form. It's very easy when we draw to overly simplify or even to not really observe, and therefore actually, instead of doing that, simply do something such as this, as if a black sticker was stuck on the wall in the place of a window. So finding every depth line that it's practical for us to add is really important in creating 3 dimensions, which takes us into realism rather than allowing 2 dimensions to stand. The third way our drawings will start to pull away from looking realistic and look cartoon-like is if we start to rely and use symbols in our drawing. And if you think, I don't use symbols, well, we've certainly all been there, and we certainly all almost began to learn drawing symbols. That was a face. This was a house. Now, no house actually looks like that, but we all knew that this was a symbol. This was an object that stood in place of the actual appearance of the house. And here's some symbolic smoke as well. And we can put some symbolic clouds in the sky. And we can have some symbolic trees as well. It's not that trees look like that, but we've all agreed that that's how we represent them when we draw. And some symbolic flowers as well. Meant to be a cat, but that was the symbol we used. And as we became a little bit older, we use this symbol for a car. We all start drawing this way, but at some point we need to transition in the way we think, the way we observe, and the way we draw, so that what we create moves away from these tendencies and becomes something that captures not just the meaning of what we're looking at, but the actual appearance of not just the subject, but the subject in its broader context. And if you're thinking, where was the symbol? Well, the symbols in this scene are in two places. If I'd wanted to make clear that we had some grass in our symbolic scene, I could make these marks and draw these symbols, and you would all know that was grass, which is exactly what I did here. And yet this neither captures what we actually see, nor the scale of what we see, nor the effect of what we see. And the fact that these marks, as they go back a long way, don't change much in size, also makes this look very two-dimensional rather than creating the effect of 3 dimensions of this grass going right back and changing our marks as we take the grass right back to capture that effect somehow. Instead, we've taken the shortcut of grass. The other symbol that I see here is the symbol of using this sort of line, this sort of outline, and we talked about how unhelpful outline can be in the first point, this sort of outline to represent foliage. And in fact, what we see is the same thing here and here, even though in life, the silhouette edging is very different because of the different size of the leaves, the different distances we see them at, and the different ways different branching forms and the different ways leaves are attached according to the species. And trying to capture these variations, of course, helps create a sense of reality. When we opt for symbolic foliage, it both adds to the two-dimensional effect, but also adds to the lack of sufficient detail to be real effect as well. This next point is very important, and it's a very common fault. And that's not just the use of symbols, but a use of pattern when confronted with some sort of detail or texture which feels too hard to draw. We convert it into a pattern. The most common pattern I see is for foliage, which is, as well as a symbolic foliage shape, we have this pattern of foliage, which is really just a squiggly line over and over on itself, over and over again. And maybe it's done deliberately more in certain places to create a bit of a darker underneath effect. And we can see that's what's happened here. We have, in fact, the same pattern on both our foliage, even though they're very different in life. It's not just the silhouette edge, which is different on these different trees, but it's the visual effect of the light on the trees and the leaves and the branches and the general way the canopy is formed. However, another very common pattern is this for bricks. And you might say, hang on, that's what bricks look like. That's not a pattern, that's how they look. But it all depends how we draw it. And when we draw it heavily and without over regard for the perspective angles and the scale, the relative size of the stones or the bricks to our overall wall, and when we do it with too heavy a line, so that the effect is much more heavy-handed than the effect of the stonework we see on our wall, all these things roll together to create a cartoony effect. And another common area with this issue is tiles. We can see the angles here aren't correct, the number of tiles totally inadequate, scales all wrong. I think as well as this being a symbol for grass, when we start to drop it all over the place without great regard for distance and so forth, we start to turn this one symbol into a pattern. And the thing about patterns is they often really help create a strong two-dimensional feeling. And of course, a two-dimensional look adds to a cartoon-like effect. The fifth point is to do with perspective, because cartoons generally are all about characters right in the front and background behind, which mostly isn't meant to be the major focus. The perspective of things further back, the perspective of buildings and so forth, is often very simplified. We often see buildings straight on or side on. Part of what gives this sort of view a sense of reality are the angles that we get, the perspective angles that we get when it's viewed from this position. A very common problem is to not draw the perspective angles as steeply as they should be. And the effect, even if we can't quite put our finger on it, is a lack of reality. This drawing starts to represent churches rather than being an actual church that we're actually looking at. And as part of perspective not being quite right, we can get our foreshortening wrong as well. And so as things move away and compress, we don't compress them, we don't narrow things as they slide away from us. So just as we've got this perspective angle wrong, we've put too much width for the angle, and now this tower is starting to look a bit folded out at us. It certainly creates a flatter look than we see in life. In a moment, we'll compare this drawing with another drawing that doesn't fall into these traps. And we'll compare the sense of reality and the sense of 3 dimensions with our reference and with each other. But this last point is to do with shadows. And with cartoons, shadows are often totally ignored, or they're very simplified, or they're just a very flat wash of dark over something without much regard for what's behind it. And I often see that sort of response in our drawing. So here, the shadow's been left out completely. Over here, the shadow is a very flat crosshatch of lines. The angles of the lines are the same over all of the shadow. The value is pretty much the same over all of the shadow. Again, it's like this is a dark shape cut out of wire mesh and just held up in front of the church. The shadow, in reality, still folds around the forms. And that's an effect we want to try and capture, whatever marks we use to represent this shadow. So how does a drawing turn out if we have a focus that takes us away from these characteristics of drawing, from these drawing techniques? And for me, it meant my drawing looked like this. I don't have heavy lines surrounding the building. I've got depth lines at every opportunity I had to include them where it was physically possible with my line width and the space of paper I had to do so. I avoided using symbols for my grass or for my foliage. I tried to capture the effect, the visual effect I could see for the edging and for the ways the branches held the leaves and so forth. And I tried not to draw a pattern over the foliage canopy, but I tried to capture the form, the 3-dimensional shapes that these large bunches of leaves create, and the shadows that they capture and cast as well. So I tried to have the shadow in some way reflect the lines, the forms, the planes, the angles of the surfaces they were on. Because I wasn't thinking line, I wasn't having to outline this path or put lines here and here, but I was free to use a range of marks to create the effect of the ground and the effect of how it looks when the building hits the ground. It's always about marks to create the effect that we see. Sometimes those marks are straight lines. Sometimes those marks might be straight, heavy lines. But if we want to capture a sense of realism, we want many more marks at our disposal. And I've done my best to capture the actual perspective angles that we have in our reference, as well as to accurately capture the foreshortening so that the way the building changes shape visually as it moves further away, in reality is captured in my drawing. And the difference between the two is very much a difference of a drawing that has far more of a 2-dimensional feel, a far more cartoon-like appearance, and one where there is a significant depth of plane in what we're looking at, where all the elements of it seem to either come forward or recede backwards, and we get a sense of what the building materials are. We get a sense of the detail without being overwhelmed by it, which is exactly what happens in reality. Now, there's nothing wrong with drawing in a cartoon style if that's what we're wanting to do. But if we're wanting to capture a more realistic effect in what we draw, these 6 points should help keep you more on track. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I drew these pictures for a different video, but then I realized as I began to put the points for this video together that they probably illustrated this video even better than the one I originally drew them for. So look, I really hope you found this helpful. But really, whatever you draw and whatever effect you're trying to create, a cartoon-like effect, a highly stylized effect, or a realistic effect, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.